as you will sense, I'm quite a kind of casual person, not really into big formality. So my plan is to kind of, do the kind of formal bits and then allow us to just kind of engage in the discussion, because I think that will be more meaningful. So I'll give you a quick run through of what we're briefly going to do. So after I have finished waffling on, I'm going to hand over to Professor Tom Ward, who is the Deputy Vice-Chancellor for the University with a focus on student education, and allow him to speak. And then we have our lovely panel. We have Peter Jones, who's sat in the middle, from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Peter is, and I hope I do get all of this right, I have researched this, but if I make any mistakes, Sagittarius, favourite colour, but no, I'm kidding. He's the Chief Operating Officer for the FCO, and prior to that he had a great deal of experience in all sorts of different places, from Ghana to Burkina Faso to wandering around Europe, having a wonderful time with British diplomatics and everything. We hope. Like it sounds terribly exotic to me.
Working hard.
Working hard in exotic places. And then we also have Henri Murison, who is the director of the Northern Powerhouse, which has an incredibly fabulous title, recruited, I believe, by George Osborne himself. So very, very important. I'm deeply impressed. I like that a lot. We're keen on the Northern Powerhouse here. Previously, you worked at Newcastle City Council, I believe, and were Research Director of the Office of Police and Crime Commissioner for West Yorkshire, I think. And you also at Public Affairs for Yorkshire Building Society, so a great deal of knowledge and experience about the Yorkshire region and talking about the North more generally. And at the end we have Molly Johnson. Molly is, I believe, a current history student here at the University of Leeds. But her purpose for being here today is that she is the programme coordinator for the British Foreign Policy Group for their Student Ambassador programme. So she is hopefully going to speak to us, not only with a slightly younger perspective perhaps, but also she's speaking from that perspective. So having said all of that, I'm now going to pass over to people who probably know considerably more than I do. So, Professor Tom Ward.
Thank you, welcome everyone. It's great to be here and to see a good turnout for this wonderful event. So, formally I should just welcome British Foreign Policy Group, colleagues, students and guests to the university. It's great to have you here. This university is an institution very rooted in Leeds, in Yorkshire, in Britain, in Europe, but also very outward looking. We're just as proud of the joint engineering school with South West Chiao Tong University as we are of running the largest access scheme in the country and welcoming local adult returners to higher education. Those three things all reflect something important about the university. As Victoria said, my name is Tom Ward. I'm responsible for education here. Not the easiest of jobs this week. And in fact, one of our wonderful panellists is one of my grumpy interlocutors by email, for which thank you. I'm not going to say much, but just want to share a few simple thoughts to start what will be a fascinating afternoon off. To be honest, one thought, and that is that we ignore the interaction between the local and the global at our deep peril. That is, the personal, the domestic, the party political, the national cannot be separated from the societal, national, international, global, respectively. And we aren't doing a great job of dealing with that. I just want to surface that thought through some deliberately provocative examples very quickly. In the 1970s, Gloria Steinem and others taught us that the personal is political, in an environment where at the time we thought it made a lot of sense and we understood what we were talking about. The question I want to raise through examples is whether we now increasingly are in a complete muddle about how to navigate between those two things. The social media revolution has given us a powerful sense of immediate access to authentic personal connections across huge distances. However, from targeted advertising to what seems to be large, organised, politically motivated forces, the exact opposite may be the case. Almost the only thing one can be confident about on social media is that not everything is quite what it appears to be. We're all familiar with the profound ideas from, for example, the Quakers, articulating an explicit link between peace on the very largest scales with the active pursuit of peace at a personal level. The phrase living lives that outwardly attest to an inward experience, and sadly all around us the horrific consequences of a failure to achieve that. The Me Too movement has hugely raised the level of discussion about one of the great injustices the world has. But already there are forces trying to constrain it to the corporate world or to Hollywood or to just one part of society. They risk undermining the impact it needs to also have on close-to-home interpersonal interactions. A particularly vivid, relevant and problematical current journey from the personal to the global or from the small to the large is Brexit. Viewed through one window, we see the hubris of an individual party leader, perhaps buoyed up by wriggling through the perils of a referendum about proportional representation in 2011 and Scottish independence in 2014, projecting an internal party split onto the entire country in the 2016 referendum, with incalculable consequences for the UK and for Europe. Viewed through another window, that same quite decisive point about proportional representation left us stuck in a political system in which the 2015 general election saw UKIP win 3.8 million votes, gaining 1 MP, while the SNP won 56 seats with 1.4 million votes. Part of an easily assembled narrative that almost writes itself of huge numbers of people feeling as if their voice is not heard. They see no benefits from the increasingly global vision of Britain, and almost any change would be improvement. Amid the many complex motivations of those who voted in the referendum to leave, this surely played some part. If the illness was too many people feeling left out or left behind by the way in which our society has evolved, and Brexit was a symptom, then the most vital reality is that the illness is still with us. And let me finish where I started, with the paradox and challenge of social media. I looked it up this morning on my phone. On Facebook, I have 757 friends. They include someone I last saw in 1975 in Zambia, who is online only when the sun shines on his solar panels in a rural part of the country, right through to members of last year's Leeds University Student Union exec. People on 5 continents, from and in countless countries. My overnight communication on Facebook concerned a Polish postdoc working in Israel, who, when I last physically met him, he was reminding me in a quite brutal fashion of the proper Slavic tradition that if you open a bottle of vodka, you finish it, and 2 other mathematicians, one in Memphis and one in Mobile, one of whom recently used a result of mine in a piece of research with a Belgian mathematician now working in Utrecht, and so on. A dizzying sense of the vastness of the world, the privilege of living in a highly connected and open world, in an accidental slice of geography and history, not plunged into conflict or censorship. However, of that 757, 300 or 400 are actively engaged voices, and of those 2, not 200, but 2, were outvoters in the Brexit referendum. 4, I think, possibly 5, are Trump supporters, out of the hundreds. All of them, the Trump supporters, on a single specific issue that you can probably guess. My seemingly large world, in fact, is a tiny one, profoundly unrepresentative of both the UK and the US. It's a global scattering of people like myself. My deceptive local is failing to translate meaningfully into the national or the global at all, on a scale of half the country in the case of the UK. That's really just a list of problems. Failures to meaningfully journey between the large and the small, and an acknowledgement that when we do see a projection of local issues onto a larger canvas, it seems to end up causing havoc. The resulting painting is not a beautiful Monet garden, but a cacophonous Hieronymus Bosch garden of earthly delights. I've no wish to dwell on Brexit, but one traditional interpretation of Hieronymus Bosch's wonderful painting is that it depicts a prelapsarian world in which humanity in its innocence is unaware of the consequences of its decisions. That's a good note to end on, and to highlight the importance of the work done by the British Foreign Policy Group, thinking about how we connect the experience of the citizen to the choices of the nation to its role in the world back to the experience of its citizens, equipping us to think about consequences before making decisions. They're all part of its role. Specifically, and particularly now when it feels at times as if we don't really have a national foreign policy, conversations about how Yorkshire will navigate the next few years are very welcome. The dynamism, human potential, cities, landscape and friendliness of Yorkshire has much to offer the country, much to offer Europe and much to offer the world. So, thank you again for being here. It's my pleasure to welcome you all, and I look forward very much to the discussions ahead, and I apologise in advance if my phone goes and I have to run from the building. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much. I don't know about anybody else, but I'm feeling quite unpopular now. I don't have that many favourites. So, on that note, so that you can pass quickly over my lack of popularity, I'm going to pass over to Peter Jones. Each panel member is going to speak for about 5 minutes, and then when they have completed, we will throw the field open to questions. So, Peter, over to you.
Peter, sorry. And just to emphasise, this meeting is on the record, just for everyone, and we're doing the Facebook Live thing. Is it being filmed? So just so that you're aware, and you can tweet. That's the other thing as well. Sorry, that's right.
We got a hashtag.
Yeah, we do.
Hashtag Global Yorkshire.
Very good. Sorry.
Great. No, it's very important to have that caveat. So I've been asked to speak just for a few minutes on why is foreign policy important to me. It's important to me because it's what I've spent most of my working life doing. I suppose that's the short answer. But I thought I'd just say a little bit about what British foreign policy priorities are at the moment, because that may not be something that we necessarily communicate all that well. And luckily, we have a piece of paper. We, I think, are the only foreign ministry in the world, and I keep asking, I keep checking, I think we're the only one who puts our objectives onto one side of A4, our main objectives, I should say, and makes it publicly available. So this is what we use internally, this is what is available externally. You should be able to find it on the Foreign Office website. In fact, we're just in the business now of updating it for the business year about to start. But I'll just give you the main elements of this, because this is the framework for all that we do, or at least all that we seek to do. And it's organised according to 3 big strategic objectives. The first is about protecting our people and our country. The second is about projecting our global influence. And the third is about promoting our prosperity. And those 3 broad strategic objectives are actually agreed across government. They were agreed in the 2015 Strategic Defence and Security Review. Obviously very important to people like the MOD and the Home Office and others, but we have internalised them in the Foreign Office. We try and organise all of our priority activity under those 3 headers. And just to give you some illustrations of what that concretely means, so under protect our people and our country, for us, obviously there's a lot of the security threat related work, counter-terrorism and so on, but also very importantly, and arguably the most important thing that we do for the people of this country, the consular work that we do. So looking after Brits overseas if they get into trouble. Everybody who's travelling on their holidays or living overseas, that consular responsibility that we have. And we had a brilliant, if I may say so, illustration of what that can mean in practice this autumn when Monarch Airlines collapsed, which may have affected people in this room. So 86,000 Brits were stranded overseas. Government knew it was coming, had done some contingency planning, Foreign Office with some of the other departments concerned, including the Ministry of Transport, and in the space of a fortnight, we brought back all of those 86,000 people. We created a shadow airline, we got them back, we met them at the airports, and there was scarcely a newspaper headline about it, which I take as a mark of success. So that's kind of the consular work. We rarely get thanked, but there you go. That's the consular stuff in crisis, but actually it's very important all the way through. So set of stuff we do under protecting our people. The second pillar is the projecting our global influence, and there's a lot that you can put into this. This is where a lot of our foreign policy is active in all the regions around the world. But for example, we have highlighted in the year that's now coming to an end, the business year coming to an end, the work that we do in the European security space, so all that we have done to build up NATO. Remember that right now there are about 1,000 British troops in Estonia and in Poland acting as part of the NATO reassurance forward deployment presence there. And a whole set of interventions around the world on conflict and stability. So there are now more British UN peacekeepers, for example, than we have had in recent years. But a whole load of stuff that we do on the global stage. And then the third area is around promoting our prosperity. Here we group the bulk of our EU-related work, also economic diplomacy that we do more broadly. So that's the kind of structure that we operate within. And obviously, there's a whole lot of detailed stuff underneath that. We have still very extensive diplomatic network around the world, 274 overseas posts in 168 countries and territories. So we have to be present in a whole load of places, and to be honest, it's quite thin in places. You know, we only have about 12,000 people around the world, but we have that global presence on behalf of Yorkshire and the UK in general. And then, if I just think about current issues of concern, so if I have that as my strategic framework, the two dominant themes at the moment are, of course, on the one hand, EU exit and making a success of that, and then linked to that, secondarily, you'll hear ministers talk about global Britain. So this is the reprojection of Britain on the world stage and thinking about what British presence on the world stage means, including in the context of the EU exit. And I think coming to a university like this is quite interesting in that context, because part of that is about, for example, the attractiveness that we may have in terms of higher education to students from around the world, and that being part of what the Global Britain offer is. Finally, just a sense of what the Foreign Secretary might say were his personal priorities for the year ahead. Obviously there's two big themes of EU exit and Global Britain, but within that some specific issues that he has chosen to devote quite a lot of personal time and attention to. And if you see where he's travelling, you see the reflection of this. So some of the global conflict hotspots he's decided to devote personal attention to, so Libya, Yemen, Burma, thinking about the Saudi Arabia-Iran relationship, being active in those sorts of contexts to see if Britain can help bring something constructive to resolution of problems on the world stage. And then somewhat you might call values issues, and within this you'll see the Foreign Secretary being quite active on the illegal wildlife trade, for example. Also thinking about female education in the world, something that matters, I know, a lot to him personally. So you'll see him quite active in that kind of value space as well as some of the classic foreign policy. Very final point, and it's linked to Britain on the world stage, Global Britain. We have a very big event coming up in a couple of months' time. It's the Commonwealth Summit, Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, biggest ever, massive. 50 plus heads of state and government coming to the UK, obviously the Queen and the royal family involved. This will be a very important moment for Britain on the world stage, and hopefully a moment of reinvigoration of the Commonwealth. So I will stop there. I don't know, that's 5 minutes.
It was absolutely perfect. Exactly 5 minutes. Henry, you have great deals.
So no, it's very nice to be here. So I was going to think about the perspectives on what Yorkshire is and what its interests are, and how those are internationalist in their general kind of future, and what the role of our more assertive views of our own economic destiny means for our foreign relationships, which I think is a natural side effect of what's happening. So we live in, remember, one of the most centralised countries in the world in terms of government. So we don't have. So if we were in Germany, you'd be talking to the person from the local lander, and they'd be sat in this chair, and they would tell you what their foreign policy priorities were, because they're pretty clear actually in terms of at a sub-regional government level. And that would be very easy then to understand how those would influence German foreign policy, because they do, absolutely. So in those areas of competency at the regional level, the federal government in Germany absolutely has to have cognizance of the interests and the concerns of those lander. Now, we're not in Germany, and so we are not also in a federal country. And so the opportunities to influence foreign policy have varied massively over the years. And I think the current climate is clearly a very interesting one, because there have been significant examples of how the kind of devolution agenda has strayed into this area, whether that's in terms of business people or in terms of our civic leaders. So I'd use the example of a number of the Northern Powerhouse delegations to the Far East in Asia over the last 5 years, where very deliberately UK government has positioned global Britain as being about the North in many ways. And I think that the deal that was done to secure One Belt, One Road investment in the north of England from China, very specifically as a Northern Powerhouse commitment from the Chinese government to the UK, the one which would only have force and effect in the north of England, is of vital importance, right? So I'm trying to unlock productivity growth in the UK to drive the North's ambition for the benefit of the whole country. That's my day job. It's not my job alone, because clearly there's a lot of other people in the room and elsewhere who have an interest and a stake in trying to unlock UK productivity through rebalancing the country. But actually, UK government policy is not the only way you achieve that, if that makes sense. And the impacts and the influences on the northern economy are not all decisions made in Whitehall. Many of them are decisions made in China, for example. And I specifically focus on that relationship because, ironically, the director of the new Leeds Nexus building is going off to Hong Kong as part of the government's Grey campaign in a few weeks' time with myself and Jake Berry, the Minister for the Northern Powerhouse, to specifically talk about the role of Leeds in the world and the role that Leeds University can play in unlocking relationships between both mainland China and Hong Kong and this country and developing closer, predominantly economic ties. But I think one of the challenges that has existed for a while is that distinction between where trade policy, which is an emerging context now, because obviously we need to have one, we didn't really have an independent one for quite some time, and trade promotion meets genuine foreign policy. Because actually, I use One Belt, One Road as a very specific example, because that's an area really of economic diplomacy, where the Chinese government wants to have a relationship with places like Teesside, because they might want to invest in things like the SSI site, which if anyone's ever been there is commonly referred to as the largest industrial wasteland in Western Europe. I like to refer to it as the largest regeneration opportunity in the north of England. I think a more equal view of it would be of a significant economic asset which has been had underinvestment in it and requires a new purpose, which provides opportunities to do many things, many of which would tie with Leeds. So for instance, if you want to make hydrogen to put in the pipes of Leeds, which Northern Gas Networks want to do, to decarbonise the heat of Leeds and to make this one of the most climate addressing places in the world in terms of addressing its impact on the global environment, you need to make that hydrogen in Teesside because you wouldn't make it at Leeds. There's nowhere to make it, but there is somewhere to make it there. So these issues are sort of cross boundaries of geography, right? So the interests of Teesside and the interests of Leeds when it comes to investment from China are exactly the same. The same way actually on some issues, actually the interests of London and the interests of Yorkshire are the same. I think what the challenge is that the interests of the UK in terms of something like One Belt, One Road are not addressed by domestic policy. So the Prime Minister's view of One Belt, One Road, to be very direct in what is still a very public forum, so I'll try and remain as direct as I can be, is very concerned because clearly the Trump administration doesn't like the growing importance of Chinese economic diplomacy, the fact that China is now absolutely, in my opinion, the dominant global economic and diplomatic power of its age. And the American government, although it is the cause of that, is very concerned about it. And I think that the Prime Minister on our recent trip could have said in very clear terms that One Belt, One Road was the best thing to have ever happened in UK foreign policy in terms of economic diplomacy with China and with the Far East. But she didn't say that very clearly and directly. She was very positive in her tone, but what she wasn't doing was practically progressing that particular issue. And in a northern context, in the context of Yorkshire, that is the single biggest foreign policy opportunity that sits on the table right now. And what the problem is, though, is that if you talk to people in China, what they require is not the buy-in of the civic leaders who all think this is brilliant. So go and talk to Sir Richard Leese, who I would argue, along with Judith Blake, the leader of here in Leeds, has got more foreign policy nous than most national politicians of their age. They can set out very clearly what the global ambitions of the North to be the leading economy in advanced manufacturing, digital, in energy, and in health innovation means in terms of what foreign policy the UK government needs to have to unlock those opportunities. I'm not always quite sure that in all of Whitehall that's been as well understood as it could have been. I think it's fantastic that this event is happening today and this discussion is happening because despite the fact that I work on these issues all the time, I very rarely have the opportunity to talk anywhere about the foreign policy implications of what we're trying to do in the North. So I spend all my time trying to unlock the domestic policy tools and the role of business in unlocking UK growth. There is almost nowhere where anybody talks about the fact that actually things that seem very remote from the interests of the northern economy actually are very directly tied up. And it's not just enough to take a great business like Sirius Minerals out to China for them to talk about what they're doing, which they did do, and the government's quite supportive of northern business, and that's fantastic. But what we really need is to unlock the keys to wider government policy so that the direct financial and economic interests of the North are not unnecessarily subjugated to concerns which could be addressed in another way. So no, I'm sure there are 25 things at the moment that the Trump administration could fall out with the UK government about at any one time, and that the wider US government might prioritise our relations. And obviously, controversially, I would say that the latter are probably more important than the former. When it comes to an issue like One Belt, One Road, it's really important that there is another way found to keep UK-US relations where they need to be, and that we don't unnecessarily compromise on relations with one country to benefit a relationship with another, when that might disadvantage unnecessarily a part of the country that absolutely requires it as its self-interest but also in the interest of the whole country. Because unlocking One Belt, One Road, and similar opportunities that will come along, that's the current one, but there will be another 20 of these in the next 2 decades, right, in different relationships we have around the world, has to be a top priority of UK foreign policy, in my opinion. And I think it was for a time. I think that this government has certainly warmed up its relationship specifically with China, but there's a bit further to go. And if Hinckley put that relationship sadly in the deep freeze, I think when it comes to our China relationship, it can't just all be about trade. We need to thaw out our wider economic diplomacy relationships, because until we do that, there are parts of the country, including here in Yorkshire and the wider north, that will lose out.
Very much. Molly.
I doubt I'm going to be able to speak for 5 minutes, having such experience in foreign policy. But a lot of my interest in foreign policy probably comes from being involved in student politics. So things like Amnesty International, Student Action for Refugees. As the Vice Chancellor also kindly pointed out, I've been more interested in soft power, Yorkshire soft power in terms of higher education the past couple of weeks. Some unhappy emails to him and the Vice Chancellor. So I've kind of done more stuff on things like the international arms trade, refugees, aid, I suppose. And I wrote for the British Foreign Policy Group an article on whether the international arms trade is actually that good for Britain. I think a lot of people are concerned with security at the moment. I think that's a main objective for most people in terms of foreign policy, but everyone seems to have different methods of how they're going about it. I talk about in that article about why I think stopping selling weapons to Saudi Arabia would be an important place to start for security, because they've been linked to terrorist organisations, advocating for extreme ideologies and things like that. So yeah, I think that's a good summary. I think I'm probably quite stereotypical student activist in that way.
Lovely. Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so I'm hoping that there are some very enthusiastic looking faces, so I will open it up to questions. Does anyone have anything that they'd like to raise with our speakers?
Hi there. I'd just like to ask a question about your opinions on the opportunities we might have leaving the customs union. Because if we leave the customs union, there may be brilliant opportunities ahead, as you mentioned, with international relations with China and America in terms of attracting inward investment. If you'd just be able to provide some opinions on what opportunities might lie there.
So I was going to say, so I think what I would say is I would distinguish the current relationships we have with countries around the world that probably don't actually tie directly to trade policy, actually. So there are lots of bilateral economic relationships which are actually not specifically about trade deals. And I think sometimes we conflate those two things unnecessarily, and that's partly the media's fault. So what I would say is that we could and should have done a lot more in building relationships with particularly the Far East and the emerging economies of the world in the last 2 decades, and we didn't do that for various reasons. And that's not actually the fault exclusively of any particular government or particular set of policymakers. It's also the responsibility of businesses who didn't take a more active role in influencing the direction of UK foreign policy. I actually think in the last 10 years there's been a lot more interest in economic diplomacy, partly because businesses have had a bigger role. And actually, I'm not a Conservative in any way, shape or form, and I used to be a Labour councillor, but the way that David Cameron started filling planes full of business people, I think did actually change the agenda of much of the Foreign Office, because I think just being exposed to the business people of the country on a routine basis, not just from a trade perspective, but across diplomacy, I think did have an impact actually on policy making in Whitehall, and it did move on in the right direction. I think my concern about leaving the customs union, and I'll play back something that Jürgen Meyer, who's one of my board of the Northern Powers Partnership, who's a Leeds lad, and now runs what is the biggest manufacturing company in the country. And he outlined the kind of customs union single market test as many business people like him would quite like to stay just as we were and remain in the single market, but that probably wasn't attainable. In fact, there were a number of people, many of them represented around the cabinet table last night, who probably would like a very hard form of Brexit. And the reality that probably where most of the country is that something in the middle that does retain some form of a customs union is probably the most appropriate outcome for the UK economy. And I, as a person, don't particularly focus on Brexit, because there are many business organisations in the country who will tell you, and some of them are represented in this room, like the Chamber of Commerce here in Western North Yorkshire, in great detail, exactly how a Brexit deal that doesn't allow for full access to the European markets would far outweigh in danger anything regardless to what you might get in the global arena. So I'm not going to rehearse those arguments because you can get them from others, and Mark's at the back. I'm sure he'll put you right at the end of the session if you want a half an hour debrief. And I don't want to derail the whole conversation in that direction, so we're not entirely going to focus on Brexit. But I think that where I would say is I think that some form of deal that retains a customs union, whether or not it's the customs union, is probably the only thing that there's a majority in Parliament for either, bluntly. I think that's something that former Prime Minister Tony Blair said on the World at One today, and I don't think he's wrong. I think he's also suggested we need a second referendum, and so I'm not again going to stray into that area because that's some of the whole hornet's nest not to kick. But what the point makes though is that in reality these decisions have real domestic public policy consequences, and traditionally the debates between the permanent representatives in the Council and the European Union, the discussions between diplomats who work at the Foreign Office, permanently seconded out at UCREP in Brussels, would be entirely veiled in secrecy and misunderstanding in the UK, because no one ever really realised there were UK diplomats always out in Brussels arguing day in, day out about what the future of Europe should look like on a permanent basis. The fact we now have people doing it is very well understood in the UK and quite problematised. But the reality is those people will have to reach a deal of some description. That will be determined by what the government believes the deal should look like. The conditionality that hasn't yet been factored in is whether that eventual deal has got a majority of Parliament, whether if you get legislation on a customs deal going through the House of Commons, that it's possible to get a deal through, even before a deal, a piece of legislation through, that would put the stumbling blocks in place to stop a form of customs union to remain within the European Union would actually pass. I don't think it will. So I think whatever happens in terms of the UK government's negotiating position, I think some form of customs union is going to be a parliamentary requirement for any negotiation, which cannot be wriggled out of. And if I'm being very blunt, I think that's probably in the best interest, particularly of the northern economy. So if you look at the work that's been come out this week from various academics on the subject, if you look at even the kind of the fag packet stuff that Treasury economists have had to do and has been leaked in the public domain, if you're sitting in the northeast right now with a very heavily dependent economy on manufacturing, leaving the customs union when you work in an automotive factory does not look like a very good idea. And I think the reality is that is being felt by a number of people who work in those industries. And I think that's the direction which the public debate is starting to go as well. But particularly here in the north, where those people may have voted for Brexit and may want to end free movement, but they certainly probably don't want to leave the customs union. And that seems to be a debate that's starting to get some traction.
Shall I go next, or do you want to?
I don't think I have anything.
I realise that's not a particularly nice thing to leave it.
So this is obviously the big question of the moment, isn't it? Well, let me. Sorry. I'll answer it. First of all, just thinking about the European bit and then about the rest of the world bit. So the overall position in the exit negotiations, as you know, we're now into the second phase with the objective of the deep and special partnership. That's the motto over the whole thing, and that basically informs all the areas that we're looking at. So trade as well as security and defence, for example, and everything. That's the statement of direction that we're hearing from ministers. And right now we're in the middle of a series of speeches that we're getting from ministers setting out what the approach is in particular areas. So we've had the Foreign Secretary speaking, Prime Minister at the Security Conference, and then others than the Prime Minister again, I think. So we should all be watching those speeches with close attention, I think. The conversation going on around the implementation period and the rules that will apply there, I think, is pretty well known. But that objective of deep and special partnership at the end of this, I think, is the driving thought. Then Britain and the world. So, as we've been saying, I think, in the comments so far, in the context of EU exit, we have new opportunities, we have a new situation, possibly new freedoms to think about the trading relationships that we will strike up with the rest of the world and intensify. Now, in Whitehall, of course, we have the Department for International Trade who are leading that agenda, but we have a role to play as well. And Henri talked a bit about the role that embassies and high commissions play around the world in promoting trade and investment in both directions to the UK and our overseas partners. I'd like to think that has become quite embedded with us. Certainly my last overseas job, I was High Commissioner in Ghana, and a big part of what I was doing, we were doing, were about the trade and investment flows between those two countries. And I think that applies to pretty well every embassy or high commission that we would see around the world. So for all of our diplomatic presence going forward, putting that centre stage, thinking what more we're going to do, we're going to have some new trade commissioners, regional trade commissioners appointed in some of our operations around the world, and their job will be about intensifying the trade and investment flows, globally speaking, to benefit all parts of the UK. So I think it's very important that Henri talks about the Northern Powerhouse. You know, we're here for the whole of the UK. That's the important thing. We need to make sure that it benefits both. Say something.
I don't have anything beneficial to say.
Yes, you do.
I genuinely don't think I do.
What do the other students think?
I don't think I've had any conversations about customs union with any students.
They're not interested in
that. Anything that's not involved with
Well, may
that.
I ask a follow-up question, not just to Mark, because that would be terribly cruel, but to the entire panel? Because you were talking a great deal about the global situation versus the European situation versus the British situation. And I'm very aware of the fact that we're here talking about Yorkshire foreign policy.
Yeah.
So is part of the problem, part of the contributing factor to the way that the people of Yorkshire generally voted, we're in a Remain city but in a Leave county,
Yeah.
is that partially because of the distance between Yorkshire and everywhere else? Is it that we feel that we're far away from London and that we have wished to express our grievances about some of the financial implications of policy upon the political elite? Is that part of the problem? Because you both mentioned, both Henri and Peter mentioned the idea of the repercussions of leaving the customs union upon local areas. Is it that people appreciated that and thought, actually, I'm willing to take a 10, 15, 20 year punt on that? Or is it actually that they were punishing politicians for more domestic problems between Yorkshire and London?
Shall I have a go? First of all, I think the answer to that may be in the room, or in the various heads in the room. But one thing from that, this sense of whether it's EU policy or foreign policy being seen as an elite quote-unquote thing, or something that's a London thing, or in a tight bubble. I mean, one of the great things about having a forum like this is that hopefully it tries to tackle that. I hate this word elite. You know, particularly, you go to events in London or in other capitals around the world. And you occasionally hear people say something like, "We, the foreign policy elite," and I just hate that. I think that's kind of a really poisonous thought. Because foreign policy and international relations are for all of us. They embrace all of us. All of you, thank you for being here, must be interested in that, and I think that's great. If there has been a sense of disconnection or something that informed the way people voted, I think that's a shame. I love the fact, by the way, that this is badged as Yorkshire's international relations and Yorkshire's foreign policy. I wonder how many other counties of England would approach it in the same way. And I speak as a Lancastrian, by the way. Thank you for inviting me over to this
You're
side.
Not getting out alive.
This side of the Pennines. But the sense of local and regional pride that embodies, I think, is terrific. So I'm quite not sure where I started with, except to say, having this conversation somewhere like this, I think, is really, really important, and getting as many people as involved. Please, all your friends, all the other students, because this affects all of us. Henri.
So the elephant in the room, right, is I don't think that the Brexit result had very much to do with the European Union at all, bluntly. So there's an element to which that then gets you to thinking, well, what was it to do with? And it was really to do with the fact that if you go to the towns of Yorkshire, so I'll get back to Yorkshire, but actually they're no different to the towns of Lancashire in this regard. Actually, so if you go to those places that voted to leave, so if you go to Keighley, very near where I live, and where I sat and watched them council these votes, so I can be very sure that it was in very specific places in the north of England where this result was most extreme. But actually, you go down the road to some much more prosperous and leafy areas, and the result was affirmatively, massively to Remain. And what that really was about is the reality that in many communities that have faced deindustrialisation, we're yet to really understand what those places are now for. And it's all very well if you live in the nicer areas of those places where you get on a train and come to Leeds every day, and that's wonderful, and I'm sure many people who work in this university do that, actually. And that's fantastic for those people. But what about people who actually work in those places? And I'm always struck by the GDP figures for Northumberland, so we'll stretch a bit further from Yorkshire. So Northumberland has got some urban areas, but its highest levels of poverty are in those people who live and work there. So if you live in Northumberland and work in Newcastle, you often are in some of the best paid jobs in the northeast of England and in the north, actually. But if you live and work in Northumberland, you live in rural poverty, which is only really makes those communities viable because of the money that flows in from elsewhere. And that's not a particularly viable thing to say to those communities, that your only hope is to be a commuter town for a nearby city, particularly if the benefits of those cities don't really transfer, whether it's to a rural village in remote Northumberland, or to a Keighley, or to a Burnley, or to a Blackburn, or to a West Cumbria even, where you might find there's lots of people with good jobs, but some of the benefits of that in terms of the quality of education you might experience or the lifestyle are not quite there. And I'm struck by one of the colleagues of the Foreign Office I met recently who is from West Cumbria, who's the Director of Americas. So there clearly is a bit of a northwest bias to the hiring practice of the FCA, that to have two senior Northerners and both be from the northwest.
I know she's very proud of it.
She's very proud of her West Cumbria roots. But I'm struck by the fact that foreign policy in this country is not run by people who don't have any understanding or knowledge of the north of England, clearly. So there are at least two people at senior level in the Foreign Office who come from and have affection and the knowledge of the north of England. I think the structural problem is that our country means that the focus of our entire policy making system is on the interests of a particular set of interests and entrenched ways of doing things that do not allow us to effectively serve the interests of those communities. So it's one thing to have a country that has these barriers and these divisions in it. It's a very different thing to do something about it. And we're starting to do that with domestic spending, so we're changing the way we spend infrastructure money. We've created this thing called Transport for the North to build effective train lines across the north. The government's very interested in and seeking to correct the imbalances in the performance of our education system. I think at the same time you have to retrofit every area of public policy, and actually whether that means actually that the interests of London as a city or the north as an economic conurbation can be better reflected in foreign policy is just as important, because some of the barriers to unlocking investment and opportunities in the north are nothing to do with domestic policy. They're to do with the realities of the global economy. And the ways you influence the global economy itself is through foreign policy. And if you want to make the north the leading place to be in health innovation, for instance, you need to influence the development of the global health industry and sector. And you can't do that from a room in Leeds without the resources and powers of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And so changing the way that structurally foreign policy is considered so that it aligns with the domestic priorities of rebalancing the country will help address the causes of Brexit, if I'm honest. But the direct reasons for why it happened is nothing to do with the European Union or foreign policy in my regards. Because actually, if we're being really trumpety about it, immigration policy is the Home Office's problem. So if anyone's to blame for Brexit, it's the Prime Minister's former department, nobody else. Do you want to blame someone?
I guess on your point about Brexit not really being just about the EU, being from London, I think I don't really have any authority to speak on how people in Yorkshire feel, but I searched through the student body of everyone I know and found about 3 people actually from Yorkshire, so I asked them their opinions. And one said that they felt like the anger that should have been directed at Westminster for the pervasive neglect of the North ended up getting redirected towards the EU and immigrants. So, and then another one spoke about how during the Thatcher years, a lot of people in their parents' generations still felt really troubled by mines being closed, unions being closed, and things like that, and how they were then looking for scapegoats again in the EU. So I think that there is a point to be made about how inseparable domestic and foreign policy can be, and that that's not always recognised fully in policy direction.
Can I just pick up on that last point? Because I think the point about foreign and domestic policy being linked is absolutely right. And you know, for us as the Foreign Office, and particularly for us overseas, you know, when you're in an MC or a High Commission overseas, that representing not just the whole of the UK geographically, but all the interests and all the issues that matter, and the broad mattering to what happens here on the street. So in terms of things like foreign investment coming in terms also of things like the security threats that come in from outside, all of what we should be doing is about, you know, meeting something that matters on the streets of the UK. So I think that's really important, powerful thought for us in the Foreign Office as well.
The gentleman at the back is handing them up to this lady here.
My name is Murison. I was born in Ghana.
You're from Ghana?
Yeah.
Excellent news.
Raised in the Yorkshire. I'm an engineer, and I just wanted to know, in terms of like things like H2020, which is the fund for renewable technology growth, that's from the EU. How does, after Brexit, how does foreign policy affect that?
Yeah.
So I was going to say, we really should bring in our friend from the university, but I think that that then becomes how you change domestic policy, right, to allow that to continue in some form. And very interestingly, whether you negotiate a Brexit deal that retains academic funding and collaboration across Europe, because that's one of the things that actually, although the European Union administers that, the very technical point is that actually it's not all European countries who fund or benefit from European level research programmes. The European Union might happen to lead them, but there are examples of where other countries already collaborate and participate. And it's on that list with like Euratom and all the security stuff that the Prime Minister mentioned in a speech in Germany last weekend, where there is no earthly reason why you would stop collaborating on areas such as that. Does that make sense? There is and that's not, none of the reasons why people voted to leave have anything to do with that. So that then gets into the detail of the negotiations that the UKREP team are doing in Brussels, right? Is that what isn't British exceptionalism, right? What can we define as being genuinely beyond the remit of things Britain might be trying to get for free from Europe? What are the things like, and the other example would be something that I think some European countries would quite like to keep, which is the Erasmus scheme. What is the list of things that are so far away from trade policy that actually we can keep being part of them after Brexit? And I think I would argue personally that there are lots of good reasons why most of what universities do should be in that bucket, but how big that bucket will be and how much interest there is in the European Union in developing that bucket to be a meaningful one, I think is still pretty unclear. But there isn't an easy answer to that question, because that should be solvable, but whether it will be or not is a matter of diplomacy, it's not a matter of UK choice.
The hope is that it will continue.
Okay, perhaps I could usefully say a word, and not an encouraging one, I fear. I think the logic you just articulated is completely compelling and accepted, and particularly Western European countries are extremely keen to maintain all the research links and to maintain the kind of explicit excellence narrative that the European research funding flows on the basis of excellence, not regional objectives, in which the UK has been a key player. But there is an elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is that the excellence-driven research initiatives in Europe, we are net winners in, to the tune of several £billion a year. And the scenario that is completely implausible is that that continues without the UK government having to find that money. And anyone who's interacting with government will be easily able to imagine what a conversation right now looks like that starts with, we need to find £2 to £3 billion a year of net additional spend in order to maintain the status quo in aspects of scientific research of fundamental importance to society and the future of the economy. It's not a happy-making scenario. But the urgency and the importance of what you raise is shared by everyone in the room. I imagine every university in the country, the French government, the German government, everyone gets it. But that's the elephant in the room, or one of them.
Could I actually just come back on that? I'll be very quick. So we don't, it's my understanding that we won't need to find additional spending to cover that cost, because we are actually net contributors to the European Union budget. So provided that that funding comes from the budget of the EU, as long as the government commit to replacing that funding once we've left, then we shouldn't need to fork out any additional spending. I feel you might disagree with that.
We've already spent that money about 15 times.
Yeah,
so that's the problem.
I mean, it's been spent twice in the last week.
Well, I bow to your superior.
No, I just, it's also in a different place. I mean, it's one is here, and one is here, and these are quite concrete things. And there are proposals being written now, in which, would you partner with a British university right now for a big European research project? It's
the reality's already
the figures on the side of the bus don't help.
Before I
build
press this
the research framework.
I also feel that I ought to mention our colleagues who are from European universities who are concerned about the viability of them actually staying at British universities where they make an incredible contribution. So there's also concerns over that, and I will throw to that lady just there.
I work for the British Council as Director England and Cities, and we operate in the whole field of soft power using the arts, creative industries, education, society, as, I suppose, to project the UK's soft power around the world, but also to act as an attractor of talent to the UK. So I suppose I'm very interested to hear from you all how you see the UK's soft power shifting post-Brexit, and I suppose what implications that might have for Yorkshire's soft power, as you mentioned earlier on.
Shall I begin?
Yeah.
So the British Council is a really, really important part of our overseas presence. So in somewhere like Accra, for example, the British Council office, very, very important part of UK PLC, and doing terrific stuff. Obviously, a lot of it now in kind of English language training and professional qualifications and all of that, but also the cultural, I'm going to call it cultural diplomacy aspects as well. Very, very important part of what we do, and that will be the case in the future as well. So this term soft power is interesting, isn't it? You know, what do people mean by it? Do people even feel comfortable with it? There's, we're in power. What's that about? To me, it's about a range of stuff about Britain's, I think, great attractiveness on the world stage. I mean, colleagues in the room will have opinions, but for example, I was at we had a meeting about a month ago where some of our leading ambassadors came back from around the world, including from places like China and the United States and so on. And that sense of still, whatever we may be feeling here, the UK brand, if I can put it that way, overseas, still feeling very attractive. Most other countries, it seems, would still kill for a lot of what we have to offer. So that includes the sort of cultural stuff, the arts stuff, the sciences stuff, British sport. Thinking about what particularly has Yorkshire got to offer. There's a bit of cricket diplomacy, for example, but other things as well. There's a lot where, and I think about my time in Ghana, the Premier League, you go around, wherever in Ghana, the little spots, they all have their TV there, come and watch Chelsea v Man United. Around the world, actually, the Premier League is a massive thing. There's a whole load of stuff that comes, I mean, in a way, soft power, I don't entirely feel comfortable with that, but that sense of the attractiveness of the UK, the vibrancy of what we have, of our life, in all its different domains. I think we have an enormous amount to offer. We need to think about reprojecting ourselves in the context of EU exiting global Britain. That's what we will be doing, and for sure the British Council has a big role to play.
Can I add something? I mean, I agree with what you've just said, but I think it's a perfect illustration of what I was perhaps clumsily trying to express earlier. But you can't get away from the personal, and to me, just about the most powerful thing we do in that territory, forgive me, in addition to the fantastic work you and your colleagues do, is welcoming international students. I mean, every international student who studies in the UK ends up with relationships here, and connections here, and the proportion of very senior figures around the world who have that particular connection with the UK is dazzling, and every time
one in four, isn't it?
Yeah,
global leaders have had an education in the UK, which is extraordinary when you think about it.
And I think anything we can do to assist people to recognise that the way we maintain that is to have a consistent welcome, be it the Prime Minister, or be it the visa process, or be it the local community, the local taxi firm, the university, and so on. If everyone projects a welcoming message, we all benefit.
I'm also interested, Henri, in how you see that cultural relations activity in a way underpinning and supporting economic prosperity.
We'll leave rebalancing cultural funding for a different day.
That's a whole other.
Because there's an element to which the kind of Leeds culture kind of experiment. I don't know if somebody touched the student body at Leeds. It certainly touched the wider city around the bit for the culture.
European capital of culture,
which the university supported along with the other education institutions here in the city, along with many others. I think demonstrated the fact that clearly sense of place is very tied to the cultural sector, and sense of place is a very valuable commodity that we shouldn't undervalue. I think the biggest challenge we have in terms of capitalising on that abroad is that economically the tie is most directly seen in some of the art and sporting forms that might be less scholarly in nature. So the extent to which Manchester's success in the global stage is tied to having two Premier League football teams cannot be understated at all. And the way in which actually particularly City act as a gateway. So the Department for International Trade's programme around infrastructure and investment brings over kind of practitioners to the UK every few months from China to see how they could invest in this country. And they go to the business school in Manchester for a week and they learn all about how the UK works. They can invest here. The first thing they do is go to Manchester City when they arrive. They did that for their first programme. They're doing it for every programme now because it is our leading asset in that part of the world. So why would you not take people to see the City training ground the first thing they do when they come to Manchester? Because it's also one of the most impressive sites of what could be achieved in terms of urban regeneration. Right? So yeah. Manchester City is also a sign of urban renaissance as much as it is a sporting sign in terms of what they've physically done, in terms of what they've used that opportunity to unlock. So I think what I would say as well is that culture is also important to the extent that it underpins wider regeneration. And again, what the Sage Gateshead achieved for Newcastle Gateshead is another very good example where we'll have the great exhibition of the North in a few months' time of fundamentally how your international brand. And I think that the brand of the North is quite powerful because Yorkshire doesn't need a Premier League football team to get Chinese investment. Right? So if you fly at Manchester Airport, you've already flown to the Northern Powerhouse. As far as the investor knows, Leeds doesn't need to play in the Premier League to get people to invest in the city. So if you're smart about it, you can pool those assets, right, so that you maximise them and they're effective. And again, I think in India probably cricket's not a bad bit of something to lead on. And Yorkshire cricketers definitely are household names in India. And that's a benefit to the North, right, isn't it? Because they're Northern cricketers, right, when you want to use them as icons in other ways. And I'm struck by the fact that when you look at how particularly Manchester tells its story abroad, they use these things so well, actually. And I think that over time, Manchester's been very clear that their story is really the Northern story, because actually most of what is happening, for instance, health innovation, stretches half the way into Cheshire, so you can't draw a line around Manchester City Centre and expect all the money's going to go there, which I'm sure some people who own property in that part of the world might hope that would be the case. And Manchester University, again, and institutions like this one, institutions like Newcastle University, I would say as well, are pulling in huge amounts of international and national investment from business and from government in world-leading capabilities. These are all part of our influence around the world, and I think that we probably need to be really careful not to undervalue how businesses already rely on those assets. And I think certainly the larger businesses I work with across the North, and many of the businesses that those in the room may be represented in the room have identified, those partnerships are vital, actually. And I think that how you use Leeds 2023, for instance, at Nippin, the woman who led that bid, who I was with last night, will be out speaking. People like East Street Arts, who you would not think as being the kind of property face of Leeds. I mean, these are people like Nick Greenan, who are genuine community activists, out selling the benefits of investing in Leeds. Because the whole point is, right, if you're building an economy based on hipsters, you need some hipsters to sell why you want to come here.
Yeah.
You don't just want to talk to the person who understands the balance sheet, you need to talk to East Street Arts. So the idea that they're an organisation, because of their role in the digital economy, they're helping unlock investment, is probably a bit of a misnomer to some people, but it's absolutely the right strategy, because you need your Bruntvoods of this world to build and refurbish great offices, but you need organisations like East Street Arts to make a digital economy work. And they're an Arts Council portfolio funded organisation, right? Yeah. At a big international property fair. That's not the normal relationship you'd expect, but that is where we're going. And I think Leeds as a city, through the 2023 process, has really cracked that, actually, and taken a bit of a march. And that, I think, if you invested in it enough and you kept that going, is probably more powerful than the Premier League football team in the end.
That's really interesting. Thank you.
I know very little about the arts or sports in Yorkshire, but I guess more personal to me is higher education and the importance of that in South Carolina, as we've already touched on. It's been used really efficiently. The level of international students that we have coming in is massive. Nationally, I think they bring in about £25 billion a year, so it's also really financial. And Yorkshire specifically is only really outstripped by London in terms of its higher education power. We've got the wide range of universities, Leeds, Sheffield, York. Outside of that, Hull, Huddersfield, Bradford, Sheffield, Hallam. We've got a huge amount of power here. And so I guess what I was alluding to earlier was the threats towards that in the pensions reform. And that's something that is outside of Brexit. It's not directly related to those issues. And I think it's something that really needs to be focused on, because if we start scaring academics away, making them feel like they're pensions aren't secure, that they're going to be financially unstable, they'll move elsewhere, and that could really damage the power that we do genuinely have here, and that we have been using so well. So I think that that's something that needs a lot more focus on.
The gentleman in the red scarf.
Yeah, Yorkshire by adoption. I watched her in '69 from the other side of the hill. Okay. Absolutely so supportive of global Yorkshire and the opportunity for Yorkshire to present its voice far beyond the local environment. Could you clarify something though? I'm rather confused about the Sheffield situation, which I understand is still being supported by central government. Am I a conspiracy theorist here, dividing room? Or at what point do you think Yorkshire coming together as a whole will happen, as opposed to a splinter group in Sheffield? I think Rosalind and Doncaster have now chucked in with the rest of us, have they not?
So
How can this really move forward globally?
I think I need to listen and learn.
Welcome to Yorkshire. So this is for the uninitiated, and to be fair, I think there's probably lots of people in the room who live in Yorkshire who might not follow this conversation. And I think most students at university would be right to have not followed it, to be honest, because unfortunately I do have to follow it for professional reasons. But essentially this is the debate about whether you have what footprint you do devolution on, right? So we are going to have a mayor in South Yorkshire, and the Labour Party is selecting a candidate. Everyone sort of assumes that Dan Jarvis, who's the front runner, will probably become the candidate, and then like Nightfaller's Day, that potentially that the Labour candidate might be elected, but I'm obviously certainly couldn't presume anything. And you will then have a high-profile parliamentarian who does favour devolution for all of Yorkshire, already taking up the office of mayor in South Yorkshire and for the Sheffield City region. I think what I would say to you, and I think devolution is really important. We're an organisation that has been very at the forefront of arguing for a settlement for devolution. Is that for God's sake, none of this is really to do with personal or political or familial identity. And that's why I'm not really too fussed about what you put on the hashtag, right? Because in reality, Yorkshire's part of the North. I work for Yorkshire, I work for Cumbria, I work for Cheshire. I don't happen to live here, but I don't have any. I don't pick sides, right? Because I could be supporting all those different things, because none of them are actually in competition; they're in collaboration. And the same is true of people whether they live in Huddersfield or live in Scarborough. They're not at war with each other. Do you mean they're in a global race to succeed? The only issue then becomes whether the interests of people in Scarborough are more closely aligned to people in Huddersfield, or people in Huddersfield's interests are probably much more to do with people in Manchester, which is the issue about how you do these things in terms of footprints. And I think when you roll it back and start from the question of why you want devolution in the first place, which is actually to unlock economic growth for the benefit of people in this part of the world who have unfortunately lost out from opportunities in life more generally through the fact that our economy does not achieve what it should achieve. And that's because the people often who made decisions about public policy have been too far away from the reality of life in Leeds and what's happening here to make decisions in the best interest of the people of Leeds, Bradford, wherever you are in Yorkshire. So all I would say to you is, when you get devolution, wherever it is and whoever has the job, the most important question isn't who they are actually, or even I would argue as someone who's kind of no longer in partisan politics, what party they happen to represent. I think what's more important is what powers have you given them, and what was the economic purpose for which you gave them that power. And the challenge I would always put to people in Yorkshire who want devolution is tell me why you want them there, not where you want them to cover. Because if you work out why you want one first, you'll find where they should cover and what powers they'll have become really easy to answer. And that's exactly what they did in Manchester under the leadership of Howard Bernstein. Howard Bernstein didn't go and say, I want a mayor for Greater Manchester, because I like the idea of someone who can go on the telly and have a go at the government every 5 minutes. What he did, along with the political leaders of Greater Manchester, is work out what powers and levers they needed to make Greater Manchester's economy a success in the global sense, not just within the UK. It's exactly actually what they did in the Tees Valley, which has not got the natural advantages, right, of Greater Manchester. It doesn't have any Premier League football teams. And the state of Middlesbrough are unlikely to have one in the very near future by any opportunity. So you look at that and say, well, actually, what does Teesside know it wants to do? Well, it wants to be a circular economy that's got a really dynamic engineering and manufacturing sector that maximises chemicals, which is what it's world beating at. It always has been really good at. And it's got a plan of exactly what it needs to do to achieve those things, to create decent jobs for people, to keep the talented young people who grow up there able to stay and make a life there. Now that's something I'm excited about. Whether or not you have to go and vote for somebody at the end of it, and whether or not that person has a job title called a mayor or not, I do not care. And actually, I think if you're in Redcar and we're a steel worker and are thinking about what your kids are going to do for a living, I don't think you care whether there's a mayor or not. I think you care whether your kids get a job or not, and that's what I'm interested in.
Can I ask you a follow-up question, Henry? It's interesting because you've mentioned about Manchester, which is obviously the example because they have their own mayor, etc., etc. But you also mentioned earlier about the identification of Manchester with the North. They've essentially kind of labelled themselves as the poster boy for the North. And I entirely get what you say about you don't really bother about the geographical area and you're not really bothered about the person, it's more about the powers. But is perhaps a potential problem that because Manchester have been so successful at labelling themselves as the kind of identifier for the North, that actually the North and the solutions for the North and the problems of the North are actually the solutions and the problems of Manchester, not necessarily the North, and therefore it does sort of matter whether or not it's a South Yorkshire or a Yorkshire, because the problems are not the same, the solutions are not the same. Is there an identification with Manchester as the North? And if there is, does that cause subsequent problems for everywhere else in the North?
I think the really interesting point though is, and I would come back to my Chinese investor, right? In order to get Chinese investment, you need a direct flight to China. I've got Phil in the room from Leeds Bradford Airport, I think. Like, Phil can get you some great flights to Europe, and I'm sure he'll develop it in other places. But he's not planning to get you 20 flights a week to Beijing, right? And he hasn't got the label, he can't deliver that. But I've got some friends in Manchester who can do that. And you're a lot closer than 2 hours to Manchester Airport than you would be to Heathrow. So the fundamental point is that the North's success does rely to an extent on some of the connectivity that Manchester has, but also Manchester doesn't have many things that the North is good at. So if you look at a map of the economic assets of the North, we have 4 prime capabilities, and digital is actually just as much in Leeds as it is in Manchester, and now a lot more actually in Newcastle, which is doing really well. The really powerful thing is how do you join those places together, which is why we want a big, nice, expensive train line. There's health innovation, which is massively focused in Leeds, massively focused in Manchester, but for different things. Clinical trials in Manchester, data in Leeds, but very complementary. But then the really fun bit is that energy is nowhere to do with Leeds, actually, other than the hydrogen bit. It's in Teesside because of hydrogen, it's in Hull because of offshore wind, it's in West Cumbria. And if you look at the example of advanced manufacturing, that's in all the places that voted for Brexit. Your Burnleys, your Blackburns, all of these people, your Bradfords actually, which has got some fantastic manufacturing companies. And actually, the reality is that it's really not a battle actually between Manchester and Leeds, because the reality is the north of England, by the standards of a Chinese megacity, is the size of a cul-de-sac. And people in Hong Kong are talking about their 200 million megacity that stretches from Hong Kong to the mainland. This is across a border, a proper border, because it is still a different jurisdiction, to Macau, and they've built a high-speed railway around this thing like a semicircle, so you can get around it, and that's taken them like a couple of years. And then they built one of the largest bridges in the world from Macau to Hong Kong, so you can drive it in the time it would take me probably to get home from Leeds at rush hour. So that's a serious megacity, right? That's 200 million people. Once we do all of this, we'll get to 15 million within a travel to work area of an hour and a half in the early 2030s if we do it all right. That's just enough to matter. That's not even properly scaled yet. So for God's sake, get a grip. Do you mean? And I don't care. I live in outer sort of Bradford, and I live really in what is kind of economically Leeds. So is everybody who lives in Bradford. That doesn't make me any less proud of Bradford's mills and its beautiful buildings. Do you mean? For God's sake, let's get a grip. And actually, people in Manchester have got no interest in dominating the north. What's really interesting is it's people in Manchester who've woken up first that their entire economy is about to overheat. And unless they can get some kids from Bradford to come and work there, their businesses are going to start leaving because they can't get the talent. So the people who want a train line to Bradford and a city centre station for Bradford to get the city of Bradford to succeed are businesses in Manchester, because they've realised this. The people who haven't quite clocked it yet are even businesses in Leeds who could walk down the road today and get the talented kids from Bradford to work in their organisations now, and they're not doing it. And I spend my life banging on doors in Leeds telling people to sort themselves out, because if they don't get it now, they're going to miss out on those opportunities, but they're on their doorstep. And the reality is, it's in the interests of our whole economy that that type of what I would call healthy competition exists. What you want is cities to collaborate. but individual businesses to have an embarrassment of riches for young people. So that the child who walks out of the school in Bradford at 18 or walks out of a university or college at 21 has got 100 great offers, rather than going back to London, which too many students here in Leeds do. It's 8,000 a year that go back, and only by getting more Yorkshire undergraduates doing their degree apprenticeship staying here are we going to maximise what is, you're absolutely right, a great asset in our universities, but one that benefits UK PLC and internationally, but doesn't quite actually do enough for the northern economy. And that's not the university's fault, that's the fault of our whole business and society in the north. But we don't exploit one of our best assets for our own economic benefit. Why on earth are we not doing that? Do we have to do it? But that's not even a city problem. That's just the same in Manchester, just the same in Newcastle, the worst even in Durham, which has got some of the biggest economic barriers, and its university does almost nothing for its area. And there are some that I would call out and say have got a lot more to do and could learn a lot from a Leeds, who is already trying to address it, but still has a long way to go in terms of making that economically make the biggest impact it could.
I guess like tangentially, I remember speaking to one of my professors a while ago about the makeup of the student body, and it's interesting just how southern Leeds Uni is, that there's a quite significant percentage of us are from London, and I think that that's probably the case with quite a lot of the universities, and I'm sure it's because fees are so expensive, people feel like if they're going to go to university, they're going to go elsewhere, they're not going to stay at home. But yeah, I think it's just an interesting point in itself that kind of in the north, the southerners have invaded a
Right, in East Leeds, they're not going to university anyway. If they were going to go to university anyway, it would probably be either here or down the road at Leeds Banker. But they're not. Too few of them are going nowhere, despite the talents they've got.
Yes, it's a comment, a plea, and a suggestion, given we've got senior foreign Commonwealth officer. I work for the Chamber of Commerce, and we do an awful lot of work with manufacturers, and I would really love the FCO to realise how modern supply chains work. I'll come back to the very first question about the customs union, and the amount of stuff that just travels between here, this region, and Europe, back and forth, to build this one product is immense, absolutely immense. And I really hope that we can explain that to you, that trading goods and trading services, they're not too binary, it's not a binary thing. So advanced manufacturing is much about trading services as it is about trading goods. So really want the Foreign Office and those negotiating all of the Brexit deals to understand it's incredibly complicated, and actually delays at customs have a massive impact on manufacturing in this region. This stuff comes off the lorry onto the production line, off the other end onto a lorry and back somewhere. So we really need that to be understood. And I had a meeting with the IT recently, and we had to explain it, which worried me a little bit. Meetings with Revenue and Customs late last year, we had to explain it to them. Again, quite concerning. So that would be my plea. And then a suggestion. I'm looking at you, Henry, because I'm going to hand this one to you. Thanks, Mark. I think the Northern Powerhouse itself, as a unit, should become a big free port, because a lot of the stuff we bring in, we reprocess and send back out again. And actually, if we're paying duties on the way in and duties on the way out, we could just, as long as it's not coming south of the border into the Midlands engine, or whatever it's called now. I think. Forget just Teesside having a free port, we should make the whole of the north a free port. And I'll give that one to you to take to Mr.
Peter, do you want to go?
I'll have a quick go just to give Henry time to limber up. Obviously, it's going to be quite a great response to all that. And so on the first point, yes, understood. And I'm glad you said you were talking to DIT, obviously have the lead and all that. Actually, I hadn't previously been terribly aware of supply chain issues until I came to this job, just in the sort of commercial procurement stuff I have to do for the Foreign Office, but I know it's a massive thing. I'm just interested, we've got the Northern Powerhouse, the Midlands engine. Is there anything below that or not?
It's just the south. It's just the whole rest of the whole rest of the economy.
The south can do that for these things.
Okay, all right. Okay, fine. Now then, what are you going to say?
Because you get into the concept of realms. That's a very interesting intellectual one for Mark for a different day. So I think on free ports, it's really interesting because the whole point about free ports is you can do them now, right? So Liverpool had one for forever. So people talk a bit about free ports like this, some newfangled idea. And I do sort of, although I'm probably getting jaded in my own youth, still, or my relative youth, I'm forced to talk to people who've had longer experience with these issues, and they sort of keep going, oh, we're just going back around the same old stuff. So what's really exciting about free ports, if you get it right, is can you tie together some tax incentives and some other opportunities that create opportunities to do things that you otherwise couldn't have achieved? And I think that is worth considering. I actually think you can be in a customs union and still have free ports if you want to. I think the really interesting point, to return to what I was saying about Asia, is that the learning from the developing world who build relationships is that often very significant close economic ties require a degree of separation of domestic interests from whatever domain you agree to collaborate on with a foreign country. And that's a concept in the UK I think we would find quite difficult, the idea that you would tie up the whole parcel of UK PLC's economy, its land, with a particular foreign government is not where we've been in the past, or a particular set of foreign interests. However, I think that is worth considering. I think in particular areas where we've got huge assets that are completely unrealised and where we've got no way domestically and within our existing footprints to do anything with them. So I think there's two different answers to your point, Mark, which is the first bit is whatever we do in T-Sport, we need to have the same deal for Hull, we need the same deal for Liverpool, because the worst thing would be not having devolution, meaning that your ports can unfairly compete with each other, which is not the whole point of devolution. It certainly wasn't the point of the Northern Powerhouse, to pick Teesside as the winner and everyone else be the loser. And actually that's something I'll be putting very strongly to the Mayor of the Tees Valley, which is that whatever deal he negotiates, actually it should be one that's available to all the northern ports, because if it works for Teesport, it should work for everyone. And that, I think, is something which is a strong support of the Northern Powerhouse. I believe that he'll be happy to support, because he's very much committed to the whole of the North, not just to what's good for Teesside. And then there's then a wider point that when you look at the detail of how you negotiate what I would regard would be much closer economic diplomatic links between the North and China in particular, I think we should be open to the idea that there will be significant portions of parts of some of our major cities where the development might be led by entities that are not UK based or focused, where that's got a strong partnership with the UK government and with the local civic leaders. But if you, for instance, could attract the interests of Chinese investors to Bradford, for instance, and the huge amounts of economic development potential that Bradford has, the current landowners and the current domestic policy actors have had 30 years to collaborate with the council to sort out that city's economic and political destiny in terms of its future trajectory. I'd argue that a partnership that allowed significant inflows of capital, knowledge, expertise, a real meaningful partnership could be very successful. And the learning from other parts of the world is that that may require different rules in that particular part of the UK to allow for that to work in an effective way. So I don't think we get a free port for the whole of the North, but I think a free port with some trade zones that have different conditionalities to them, based on very significant undertakings around what that means on both sides, is, I think, more politically acceptable than financing a nuclear power station from China, and I think would be much more impactful communities than that deal was. And I think we shouldn't reject those opportunities just because Hinkley wasn't a huge success, which I don't think it was, sadly, for the UK government. I think we could do that again and do it much better, and I think in the North there are the opportunities at scale to do it.
I think it's Mario.
I'm a very business-minded individual, and I'm getting a lot of talk about funding and investing, but like, how much of that is set aside for startups and small businesses, and how accessible are they? Because I have a few ideas that I'm trying to launch. I'm struggling to find good financing that doesn't involve giving away maybe half the company or it's matched, so that means I have to work to gain that money before they give me money. So I want to know how does it filter down to people like me who's just students with brilliant ideas?
So I think I would direct you to North Invest, who are literally down the road and about to open a hub in Platform, who would be very keen, I think, to talk to you about that, because there are people in the North who'd like to help you with that problem. Because I think we'd be the first people at the partnership to tell you that SME business growth is where almost all the economic development is going to come from in the north of England, so I would absolutely agree with that. And I think your experience of people as a spin-out from the university trying to take a lot of what you have but not a lot in return, I think, isn't an uncommon one. I think the thing I would say about the university, actually, is I think the university's own support and engagement for students wanting to spin out here at Leeds is very good.
Yeah,
and so
part of the incubator program, which is at the university. It's just, there's still very difficult to get funding. So, for example, one of my businesses is an app, and I would like to make that, but in in this, just doing that balance off is impossible.
No, well, I'll get you details and refer you to North Invest. So because of this problem, an entrepreneur in the city set up his own business, has set up a platform and a group of people who ethically want to invest in growth businesses and support them, but particularly to allow you to retain ownership so that you can grow that and keep that. Because the biggest problem in the north is that we have loads of very dynamic companies that are sold too early in their development. And it means that you don't get unicorns by doing that, right? So if every high growth business ends up in someone else's ownership 3 or 4 years in, then the people who set it up have got no interest in it, right? Because they're not going to make any money out of it anymore. And the people who buy it don't necessarily know what to do with it. And actually, making sure that you allow people to hold on to their own businesses for longer is one of the strategic things you can do if you want to build an entrepreneurial-based economy. And it's absolutely something we'd want to help you with. So I'll pass you the details for the people you should speak to.
Just listen with interest, Henry, your comments about the 30-year plan, that's in the distant past, in terms of Chinese investment in Bradford. My concern is that that will come with a price, and the price could well be a dilution in terms of conditions of employment, and I suppose what goes around comes around. We did all this in the past, didn't we? We're now going to be on the receiving end of economic colonialism. It's going to be driven by China, and I fear the terms and conditions and what will happen to our people who, certainly in my lifetime, have enjoyed employment protection and the benefits of living in a democracy. And I wonder what sort of price, if I were the Chinese, I would do exactly the same thing. I can see where they come from, okay? But from our side of the fence here, how can we guarantee that we maintain the protections and we maintain the integrity and the freedoms that we fought so hard to maintain when we are sort of at the behest of these megabucks from China?
Well, this is the brilliant part about this, because this is a real foreign policy debate, right? This is why Tom wanted to come here. So I would argue with you in response, which is that I think that you can have those things that are particular to our country, our domestic policy framework, and actually what inflows of capital require is certainty around the regulatory footprint and the economic environment. And those are some key factors you can stabilise. Now, the UK has some great attractions. So there's a reason why Chinese people buy property in London, right? Because this is a great place to buy and invest in something. The issue is that economic investment isn't particularly productive at the moment, because all it is doing is helping create asset bubbles. So from my perspective, that's a pretty negative impact of just, because this is already happening, right? So without economic diplomacy, money will inflow into the country in a very random way in the interests of those actors themselves. What the interesting and fun bit of this is that the Chinese government would quite like to stop some of that and actually keep that private money that isn't necessarily being spent appropriately, because they don't want outflows in general from China. Actually, they want to keep their own investment capital for themselves. But they've made a strategic decision that there are certain types of investment opportunity that don't exist in China that are worth investing in because they have a foreign policy benefit to the Chinese government. And we're in this unique position, right, that the Northern Powerhouse is on this list. And we're almost unique, actually, among developed countries to have this status. But that's been the case now for a number of years, and we've not capitalised on it. Now, some of it's because of concerns like the ones you've expressed, because actually, absolutely, that's why you need a foreign Commonwealth office, right? Because people like me are chomping at the bit to take advantage of it. We need people who can make these deals and can be trusted to get the best interest for UK PLC. Because absolutely, that's where diplomacy is important, and where the Foreign Office is probably the best vehicle in the world for getting a good deal. But what you have to do as the North of England, I think, and that's not for me alone, but that's for us all collectively, is determine what deal we would actually want. Does that make sense? And what are the things we think that we need help from outside of the UK to do? Because I would argue in specific fields where you could make a strong case for it, having, a bit like Mark alluded to around trade barriers, being able to move things more easily between China and the UK, and then being able to use Chinese IP in a way that's safe and works for them, would be one of the things that I think you might want to consider. Now, ironically, British businesses think all the time about the dangers of sending their IP to China because they don't feel it'll be protected properly. You have to then reverse that thinking and think, well, what are the things that would stop someone from outside the UK wanting to make a very significant investment in a quite high-risk scenario? And then try and answer those questions in reverse. And I don't think what people want is cheap labour, because to be honest, you can go to Nigeria, You can go to loads of places where the One Belt, One Road initiative already is, Pakistan, Bangladesh, you can get that, easy. That's not why the Chinese designated the Northern Powerhouse as a potential place for investment. They designated it because they believe that the potential of the Northern economy, with all its assets, has been underutilised by UK PLC. And you know what? They're right. So the underinvestment in our historical industrial base in the north of England has created a strategic opportunity for somebody else to realise the benefits from that. Now, I think some of the benefits should flow back to the north of England and to the UK's tax revenues. Thank you very much. But if somebody in the UK government can't find the resource to invest in and back some of those higher risk opportunities that would potentially have great benefits to the UK, why shouldn't we let somebody else take a share of the risk, I would argue. But what you make is a very strong case for what you should ask in return, which is some safeguards around what some special status for parts of the north could mean and how you would protect the people in the UK who would work in those schemes and who might have themselves a stake in them. So where they might be landowners, where they might have businesses affected by it, who might want to have economic ties to it. Because obviously what you don't want to do is create an environment where you build infrastructure in the UK with no domestic supply chain because you did a deal in China. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is using our relationship with China to accelerate infrastructure development, particularly in the north of England, and accelerate development of places that are currently wildly underutilised by the UK. So if you unlock Bradford by giving it a 5-minute train connection to Leeds, and on with that a 25-minute connection to Manchester, suddenly everyone in the world's going to want to put a business in Bradford and locate something in Bradford. But if you then take 20 years to take advantage of that opportunity, then you've missed the goal, right? What you need to be doing is start now. And that's what they did with Crossrail. If you look at Crossrail, the investment in London, Crossrail investment came before the Crossrail stations, not after. And the last bit is the bit you put on top of the station, which is what's helping pay for it. So that's how UK PLC is paying for that infrastructure, because you build a train station in London, a new Crossrail station, what you put on top of it is worth exponentially more than anything else you could have built in London in a similar location. That's really powerful as a tool. In the same way, I think you can unlock economic diplomacy to front-end investment in the north of England to take advantage of the translational infrastructure we know we need anyway, and UK government wants to pay for anyway. Now that, I think, is a discussion and a debate we need to have. But the point of the group coming here today is that we don't currently have those debates because we don't have a northern foreign policy agenda, but we need one because these things are going to happen anyway. But if we don't have a debate with people, we don't bring people on a discussion, then we're going to make decisions like this behind closed doors, not by people like me, but by governments, by businesses themselves, and the people of the north will not have a stake in that. And that's why you need to have these debates like today, because we need to have a conversation as a country, and the north needs to have a conversation with itself about what its priorities are and what it's prepared to accept as its bottom line.
Can I add something? I think it's a really interesting question. And I would add, because I think this links back to the conversation about global Britain and soft power, if we want to use that term, and attractiveness. So it's worth remembering that we're not just a recipient. You know, we're still sixth biggest economy in the world, massive outward investor as well as a receiver of inward investment. You know, there's a kind of, you know, there's an attractiveness to us still, as we've been talking about. You know, and as Henri's saying, you know, the rule of law, the democratic basis that we have, all the creativity of this country, all that the education sector has to offer. All of that, I think, is a powerful part of what we are, and I think what, you know, foreign investors and foreign partners like about us and would not want to erode in some ways. So I think the question is a really intriguing one, and I think it's worth thinking about it. But I think there should be a certain amount of confidence in what we are still, you know, and being bold about that on the world stage. Good question, though.
It's interesting that you raised that, Peter, because I wanted to ask you about the idea of soft power, which I know is a term you don't really like. But you mentioned the idea of the role of the Commonwealth in your opening statement. The Commonwealth is an organisation that, for many people under the age of 25, is just nothing. It's just a historical kind of overhang from empire days. Now, I do appreciate that there are different arguments about the Commonwealth, but obviously the Commonwealth is entering a period of flux. There have been discussions about what the Commonwealth ought to look like for quite a few years, and there's also an argument about the kind of small states, that the Commonwealth benefits small states as opposed to large states. Do you think that there is a reformed role for the Commonwealth? And if there is a reformed role for the Commonwealth, how would that benefit Britain and perhaps its regions more specifically?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I think those challenges are out there. So the Commonwealth is a really interesting collection of countries. You know, it has the historical origins that it does. And if you look at what it means in today's world, you have, I think it's about a third of the world's population are within the Commonwealth, largely because of India and Pakistan. It's a massive population there. But it's you've got big countries, small countries, it's really small countries, little island countries, now a whole spread. So you've got a really interesting kind of cross-section of the world community. And so, if you're pursuing issues like the promotion of human rights, for example, or thinking about climate change or whatever it may be, there's a really, really interesting and possibly quite powerful collection of countries there who can get action done on the world stage. Now, I think there is an issue about connecting the Commonwealth with publics in all the various places, and we can see what Molly has to say in a second. But when we have the summit, there'll be various kind of fora in the margins. That'll be a trade one, there'll be a youth one, there's be a lot on women's rights as well. If we get it right, and there's a massive amount of effort going into this in the Foreign Office and across government, it could be a moment of real rejuvenation for the Commonwealth. One important thing, and one reason to be hopeful about the Commonwealth, is that other countries keep wanting to join it. Right? So I think there's something about, if people want to join your organisation, there must be something attractive. So even some countries that were not historically part of the British Empire, in Mozambique, for example, Rwanda, so that. Well, why do they want to join? They must think there's something kind of interesting in this. We've just readmitted Gambia. That's a really positive step. And in that context, one of the really important things about the Commonwealth is this sort of bastion of democracy. So you've got to be fully functioning democracy to be part of it, and it's an encouragement for some countries to get back on the right track. So I think we have a real moment of opportunity. But I want to know, what do you think of the Commonwealth?
I feel like I probably have a lot more of a sceptical and negative opinion than most other people have. I think it can be quite problematic trying to view Britain as morally superior within Commonwealth or the world in general. Studying history, I'm always looking at how bad the empire was, and I think particularly when you're comparing to places like China, I don't think we can see Britain as having such a clean slate in its trade and investment and industry. Our history is really bloody in that sense, particularly involved in the Commonwealth. And so I think that we have to remember that we still export a lot of our labour out to Bangladesh and don't pay workers properly there. I think that if we're looking at businesses, maybe we need to start bringing it actually back into the UK where we will pay people properly. I guess you're asking about my opinion of the Commonwealth. I don't have a particularly positive view of it.
Can I just come back on the point? Because I actually have a contrasting view. I think that, of course, our history in the Empire is not particularly a rosy one, a rosy picture, but could we not try to correct the ills of our past, perhaps, by using the Commonwealth and encouraging investment in those countries, trading with those countries, especially post-Brexit? There's an opportunity here to bring more prosperity to the Commonwealth, and perhaps we can't correct the ills of our history entirely, but perhaps we could acknowledge them and try at least to improve the contemporary situation of those countries.
I agree entirely. I think that it's the hierarchy situation of it, that it's still Britain is at the head. And I think that's where the issue comes, is that if we want to make a positive impact within the Commonwealth, it maybe needs to be more of an equal footing. But I don't know the details of how the Commonwealth
Just one
works,
factual point.
so.
Her Majesty is at the head, Britain is not.
Okay.
Don't put it that way.
Interestingly, that won't necessarily be the case, so it's up to the Commonwealth to decide, isn't it, who its next leader will be.
It is. Sorry, that lady wanted to just interject.
I do think, though, that one of the things we need to recognise is that the Commonwealth and the roots of trade and migration have actually really shaped contemporary Britain today. When you look at the Bangladeshi and Indian population here, the contribution they've made to the culture, the social life of this country is absolutely phenomenal. And I think there is a real opportunity with CHOGM, as we call it in British Council, which is to actually explore what a different type of relationship, multilateral relationship between the Commonwealth countries could look like, that really involves mutual benefit, mutual exchange, that brings social, cultural, economic and educational value on all sides. And I think that is a very unique opportunity, and I really feel very strongly that actually young people have a crucial role to play in identifying where that value could lie and actually constitute a lot of that value too. So I think there's a bit of a call to arms actually about the Commonwealth, because I think actually when we leave Europe, the Commonwealth countries become a very, very unique network, around the world that actually young people in the UK could really begin to develop strong relationships with. And I'm from Ireland.
That's another question. I wanted to ask, following on from this, what would be an ethical, eco-sustainable future policy? What would the principles be for Yorkshire, for the UK, for the Commonwealth? At one point we did have something called an ethical foreign policy.
Ethical dimension to foreign policy.
Quite right, correct.
Mm-hmm.
So those of us who were working in foreign policy before that, that was Robin Cook, wasn't
Yeah,
it?
1997. Yeah.
We like to think that we tried to be ethical even before that, but as an articulation, it was ethical dimension. Was
Douglas Hurd officially described it as piffle, because
Did he?
he said that the Conservative governments had been just as ethically minded in their hierarchy. They simply hadn't made such a big deal about it. Yeah.
Well, Molly's mentioned the business of outselling arms to Saudi. And what would that mean for Yorkshire if we didn't sell arms to Saudi? I don't know whether we've got any armaments.
So to note, you talk about areas where the Northern Powerhouse is strong. So BAE Systems, would you want to say a word about
certainly have a big impact in Lancashire. So I think the challenge comes, doesn't it, that I would say that I thought that the comments at the beginning about our arms policy are really fair criticism about the fact that you have to decide, don't you, what your priorities are and what is appropriate and isn't appropriate. I certainly would say that there are an awful lot of people who work in the north of England who make their livelihoods building armaments. And actually, if you look back in the history of Leeds, I only live up here because my dad moved up to work at Vickers Town Factory. There are a lot of people whose families will have worked in the armaments industry in this town, in this city, in the wider area, and still around. Now, is building Typhoons the only thing that we could do in Lancashire? And in the end, actually, we'll run out of places that want to buy Typhoons anyway. So you shouldn't pin that as being the centre of your economy. But the challenge we've got in the north is that we particularly do excel at building very high-performance engineering products. And the reality is that the armaments industry is a very large part of the high-value engineering supply chain. So you can build civilian planes, and we build bits of those for Boeing, and the Boeing are investing in Sheffield, but we predominantly are in the defence aviation sector, not in the civil aviation sector in the north. And so,
wind turbines instead.
well, I think the problem is that the reality is that a large part of the supply chain is specifically building products for a particular plane. So we build those in Lancashire. We build a lot of parts of them in South Yorkshire actually, and we're already losing a lot of jobs because we aren't building enough for the UK use. And we're also not selling enough abroad at the moment to meet the number that we could build. So what that then makes you think is that when we come back to think about what the North's foreign policy should be, I think you should have a proper debate about who you should sell things to and what conditionality you should have. And to be fair to the UK government, we're pretty strict about who we will sell things to, and we enforce those conditions probably more strictly than almost any other developed nation in the world. However, the interesting point is you could take a very, very hard line on defence exports and put a lot of people out of work overnight in parts of North England. That's a public policy choice. The argument is, though, the person who articulates that position, which is a perfectly fair one to hold, probably should understand and meet the people whose jobs they're going to destroy in the process and be able to articulate to them or put a case to them for why that is the right thing to do. That's the point about living in a grown-up democracy, right? That you should understand the implications of policy on both sides. The same way that people who work at Samlesbury should understand and be cognizant of that BAE should behave properly to only sell those to the people who should have them, not to others. And that's about being a grown-up country.
And come up with the alternative use of those skills, which, as you say, those people have got enormous skills with it.
And I think my only criticism of our industrial policy is that BAE's response to the fall of the order book is to sack engineers. And if you get in a taxi in Preston, the likelihood is it's driven by an engineer. Because that's who drives taxis in Preston. So that's a problem of our country that we've not done what you've articulated, and we've not done it consistently.
Can I just very quickly ask you, where would this debate take place? In Leeds, in Yorkshire? I mean, I'm not aware. You've talked about those things, but it's really companies that are making decisions. It's not really. There's a democratic deficit in what you've been describing.
I think we're here, aren't we? I mean, I'm being blunt.
How many of us are here, really?
I think the point that I would make is that I think that there are debates about arms control in Parliament all the time. If Fabian was here, Fabian feels very strongly about these issues and has articulated arguments very similar to your own and represents the City and Parliament. So I would challenge you on the democratic deficit point. I think that my issue would be that I'm not sure that many people in the Labour Party in this part of the world would even know what's happening in a part of the world where there is one of the strongest trade union representations in the country, at Samlesbury. And that's a problem partly about the North, that the North needs to understand what we do for a living and understand the ethical consequences actually of our own actions and what we make our money from, and then debate how you invest in these things, because the reality is the armaments industry is not going to continue to provide the jobs in Lancashire and South Yorkshire it currently does. And regardless of actually of whether you are harder or not, you will have some degree of deindustrialisation in the aviation sector, in defence aviation. Then the question becomes, what is the path for that and what drives it? Is it simply order book or is it policy change? And I would argue I'm as concerned about both actually. I'm not really in the business of arguing about whether we should sell them or not. All I can tell you is what the consequences of not doing it would be, if that makes sense, not selling them. Somebody else needs to answer that other question because I'm not the expert or the person who can tell you what the answer should be.
Could I just ever so briefly interject a fun fact before I ask Molly and Peter just to, we're literally out of time, so just a couple of seconds. You've already mentioned Vickers. It's quite interesting that Vickers Tank Factory built Challenger 2 tanks about 6 miles down the road. Vickers was a very large tank factory and was eventually closed, largely because it was decided that they couldn't have 2 factories in the north of England. Strangely enough, the smaller of those 2 tank factories was actually in Tony Blair's constituency, and that's why it remained open and the one open.
It's not strictly true. It's in Benwell.
It's considered the closest of his constituency.
It's about as far to Benwell from Sedgefield as it is to here, but that's a different argument.
Henry's ruining my point.
So I would challenge you on that one.
You go next, and I'll go next.
I had a couple points that I would try and get through quickly. You spoke about having discussions with people that will actually be impacted. There's been a struggle on campus for about 5 years to get BA systems out of the careers fairs, essentially, because of their involvement in conflicts like Yemen. And so I have spoken to quite a few engineering students who are directly involved in that, and I do agree that a lot of them feel very strongly that they want BA on campus, but that's because of the type of funding that BA give to this university and a lot of other universities. I think your point on the environment, the arms industry is stagnant, it's not growing, so how can we really make the argument that that's what's good for the North or the UK generally? I think it's more that that industry has so much influence and power, that's why it continues. Whereas if we put that money into places like renewable energy, I wrote a lot about this in the article that BFPG published. If we put that money into renewable energy, that's a really growing industry at the moment, and I think it would benefit them. I mean, the North has so much power in its engineering capacity. Why can't we be building that type of machinery here? I think I can't remember the exact figures, but recently a few thousand, 10,000 something, left BAE and got moved into the renewable energy sector. So it seems like quite a clear drive. Plus, I can't remember the figure either on this, but the majority of the UK don't support selling arms to Saudi Arabia anymore. So why are we still pursuing that policy?
So first of all, on the arms export side, in my previous job before I took on this one, I was our international security director, including responsibility for arms export licenses from the Foreign Office point of view. In terms of the democratic oversight, I've personally appeared in front of parliamentary committees on this subject, so there is something going on. We have the consolidated criteria which try and fuse, all the kind of aspects of this. So looking at a country's human rights performance, looking at whether we potentially exacerbate a conflict. And I can tell you, you may not like how particular decisions come out, that a lot of care and attention and agonising goes into this process within government. In some cases, in a lot of country cases, of course, it's not problematic. And this, in terms of exports, countries have a right to defend themselves, and in a benign way, and we're part of that too. But it's a big debate. I just wanted to make the point that there is a lot of parliamentary scrutiny and oversight, and a very rigorous national set of criteria. And I do think, I know I'm biased, I do think ours is applied as rigorously as any in the world. But I wanted to end on a hopefully a more positive note from your point of view, which is you talked about the eco-friendly side of things. So for us, I mean, the climate change agenda has been a big part of British foreign policy, and governments of different political colour through recent years continues to be the case. And more immediately and personally, I was just about to clear my desk before Chris was to go off, and a little note pinged in from the Foreign Secretary's office saying, could I please, as soon as possible, come up with a plan to remove the use of plastics in the Foreign Office global estate? So bear in mind, this is not just the UK, it's in 168 countries. So, you know, a nice bit of homework. I think ministers have all been watching through Plan It, fine. And we've come up with a plan. So I think today, probably live in the Foreign Office, will be a message from me and the Foreign Secretary. I think they'll be doing a little interview on this. And a plan, we will be removing avoidable single-use plastics, which is the term of in our UK estate. This year, we will commit to get rid of it from our global estate by 2020. So we as a department will do our bit to be eco-friendly. So we'll be my
I hate to draw a good discussion to a close, but I'm afraid that we are out of time. So please will you put your hands together to thank all of our